What is going on, guys? Gaston right here, and in today's video we're gonna be comparing these two incredible lenses that I have in front of me. We're talking about the G Master and RF, both 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8. Now, there is a lot to love about this new lens, but also there's a lot to love about the Sony G Master, which is the lens that I actually happen to be using the most for the longest. Now, if you own an EF version of the Canon 70 to 200, everything that I'm gonna say about the Sony G Master is gonna apply basically the same because both lenses are very, very, very similar, if not identical. The obvious right here is what you're seeing right now. Look at the size of the RF lens. It's 27% smaller than the G Master. Look at that. But it's also 28% lighter. And when we're talking about 28%, it's more than a quarter of the weight taken off from the lens. And this is what actually attracted me so much about this lens. But before we talk about all that, why don't we go up and close and review the features around the lens. But before we continue, why don't we talk about the lens hood? They usually don't get a lot of love, and I want to talk about them so I can ditch them off the table. Now, the main thing that you're gonna notice here is that we have these little windows that we can actually retract, and these windows are gonna be used if you put an ND filter or polarizer, so you can actually rotate them and use them this way. Other than that, I mean, there's nothing around the lens. On the G Master version, you have some sort of soft material, very matte material, and it feels like felt or something like that. Whereas on the Canon, there are some grooves in here. Again, it's a matte finish inside, and they're both black. Obviously, they want to block light and avoid the light getting into the lens. Now, as you see right here, the Sony version has a tripod mount, and this one also comes with a tripod mount, but it's so small that I actually don't feel that it's necessary, so I took him out. Okay, so we're gonna start with a G Master and talking about some of the switches that we see right here. So we have an autofocus and manual focus switch. Then we have a distance limiter that goes from full to -3 meters. We have an on and off for the image stabilization, and we have 2 modes of image stabilization on the Sony. Now let's talk about the switches on the Canon. The first thing that you're gonna notice is that the switches have been reconfigured here and are positioned in different places. The first switch is going to be the distance limiter, which it goes from full to -2.5 meter. Second is going to be the autofocus and manual focus switch. Then we have right over here the stabilization on and off. And on the RF, we have 3 modes of image stabilization. Now let's talk a little bit about the modes. On both lenses, mode 1 and 2 are gonna do exactly the same thing. Mode 1 is gonna enable horizontal and vertical axis, and ideal for steady subjects or generic shooting. Whereas mode 2 actually locks the horizontal axis and enables the vertical axis, allowing you to pan and stabilize your footage that way. Now, because imagine having stabilization in horizontal axis and you moving the lens is gonna try to stabilize that. So for that reason, that one gets locked so you can actually use the lens. So if you're gonna be shooting sport, you're probably gonna be in mode 2. And if you're gonna be shooting everyday things, much more stationary, you're gonna be using mode 1. Now on the RF, mode 3, what it does, it actually enables image stabilization both axes once you release the shutter. And this is actually a pretty cool idea and feature because these lenses get used a lot in low light situations, especially at events and weddings. So if you're gonna be shooting at a super slow shutter speed, like let's say 1/40, and you're gonna be at the 200 millimeter range, remember, the longer you go, the more you introduce motion and jitter. This is going to stabilize the footage as soon as you release the shutter. I think it's a pretty cool feature. I actually tried mode 1 and 3, and in my opinion, I haven't seen a lot of difference, but again, I haven't put that many hours in this lens yet. Now, on the Sony lens, you're gonna see that we have 3 switches, 1, 2, and 3 over here. You can configure the switches to do whatever you want. Now, on the Canon version, there are no switches anywhere. So in my opinion, I don't get to use those switches. I usually use all the configurable buttons on the body of the camera. But if you're one of those photographers that like to configure switches on the lens, well, you have 3 on the G Master version and none on the RF Canon. So the Sony G Master is made out of a magnesium alloy, whereas the Canon RF is made out of plastic. Now, there are benefits about both. I think this one is much more durable than the plastic, but the plastic also allows the lens to be lighter. The metallic housing construction is going to be much more durable, where the plastic is going to be probably more prone to crack, but at the same time it's going to be lighter. And to be honest with you, it doesn't look any cheaper than the Sony G Master. You let me know. Now let's talk about the rings, because there are some difference right here. Now on the Sony G Master, you're gonna find the zoom ring right on the back, and at the front you're gonna find the focusing ring. It is very, very smooth, whereas the zoom ring on the G Master is very draggy. Not as fluid. Now let's switch to the RF, and like I mentioned before, on the RF we're gonna see the opposite. The zoom ring is actually at the front, and the focusing ring is actually at the back. Now the zoom ring of the RF is much smoother than the Sony G Master, and even the focusing ring is a lot smoother as well. Now the 70-200 is the lens that completes the trinity, and we're talking about the 16-35mm or the 15-35mm if you're talking about the RF system, the 24-70, and then is the 70-200. So this lens is a very versatile lens. You know, it's gonna be a great lens for outdoors, it's gonna be a great lens for wedding, and it's also a great lens for portrait at the studio. I use the G Master a lot at the studio. Now when talking about cost, these lenses are going to be in the $2,000 and up. We're talking about the Sony G Master that right now goes for $2,200, and the RF lens goes for a whopping $2,700.
What? What?
Now the total length of the Sony G Master is 200mm, whereas the RF is only 146mm. So the size difference is very, very noticeable, as well as the weight. Another great feature of this lens is that both lenses feature weather sealing. But in my opinion, there is a flaw or a problem with the RF lens, and let me show you right now. If I extend the lens to the 200mm and I shake the lens a little bit, kind of like, you know, you'll be moving your camera.
They call me Cuba Pete. I'm the king of a rumba beat.
You can hear a clanky noise coming from the inside, and the lens feels that it's moving actually, and that is a problem to me. That is something that I don't see in this lens, even though all this zooming happens internally, but it is actually extending internally. So let me set it to the 200. So none of that is happening over here, where over here, even if I actually retract it to the 70, again, no one is gonna be doing that, but it's something that I noticed as soon as I picked up the lens and kind of like moved my hand like that. Suddenly you feel the elements or something moving inside. Now another thing that I forgot to mention, this lens features a locking for the zoom, and indeed this lens is gonna need it, because like that it doesn't extend, but without this the lens comes off really easily. And I think that's one of the reasons why it feels that the zooming ring is actually smoother, because it's really easy to actually zoom. Now, one of the things that I wish you could do with this locking switch is to allow you to actually lock the different focal lengths. So for example, if I want to be at 100, I would love to lock it, but you cannot lock it. It doesn't lock. Or be at 135 for portrait, or be at 200 and lock it, or be at 85 and lock it. But that is something that you cannot do with a switch. That to me would have been a great feature for portrait photography. Now it is nice to know where you're at. So 85, 135, 105, but unfortunately you cannot do that. What a waste of a switch. Now let's talk about the handling of the G Master lens. The first thing that you're gonna notice is holding the lens with one hand. You're gonna notice this lens being very front heavy, and that's one of the downers about this lens. I happen to actually have to rest my hand more often than with the RF version, just because of that. This lens takes a toll on your wrist very, very quick. Now, when we talk about the RF version, this is a lens that is no different than a 24-70mm, so no problem there. I shot for hours and hours with this lens with no problem in the wrist. So with the RF, we don't have the problem. The lens is very light, and again, because it's shorter, the center of gravity is completely different than on the G Master version. So it's really easy to handle this lens handheld, and usually I have a side strap right here that locks my hand, and you know, it makes it even easier to handle the lens, just like I have it right here on the G Master version. This is a Peak Design strap. In my opinion, the RF is the winner when it comes to handling. Now let's talk about autofocus for both lenses. Now this is where the Sony G Master stands out. The Sony G Master has better autofocus performance overall, better eye autofocus, and also better tracking performance. Whereas the RF has a good autofocus, eye autofocus is nowhere near to the Sony G Master, and tracking is a little bit laggy as well. So when it comes to that department, the Sony G Master is a winner. Next up, I want to talk about color rendition and sharpness. Now, both lenses are going to give you great images and really sharp images. So if you have to pick a lens over the other because of quality of the image, I mean, you can actually grab any of the lenses and you're going to obtain exactly the same quality of image. And even though back in the days when Sony had a different color science, you could tell that the Canon was a little bit better at colors, but now I feel that both lenses are very, very close, and the difference is very, very minimal, if any. Now let's talk about the conclusions. The Sony G Master is a lens indeed. It's heavier, it's much more front heavy. Therefore, it's a lens that sees less airports and less cities than the RF version. Traveling with this lens can become a real pain in the back because it is heavy. A lot of the times, you know, I debate whether to bring this lens and not bring other lenses, and a lot of the times end up bringing a few primes in the 24-70, but when I'm there at the event, I wish I brought it, and that is really frustrating. I don't like to check my gear. I like to carry all my gear with me, carry on. So this lens becomes a little bit of a problem when you have to travel. Now, the RF actually solves that problem because of its size. It's actually the same size as the 24-70 millimeter. So I can bring one more lens because of that. And when it comes to weight, probably I can bring 2 more lenses. So being able to actually carry the same amount of features, the same focal range in a much smaller and compact format, to me, that is actually priceless. So this is it for today, guys. Which lens would you pick? Do you like the RF lens? Do you own the G Master? Do you own any of these lenses? What is your experience with these lenses? If you have one of these, why don't you drop your comment down below and let me know what you think about these lenses. If you like this review, give it a like, and as always, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification button for more content like this one. Until then, guys, see you later.